So hello, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to our policy presentation, Draft Recommendations Under Consideration. It is my pleasure to welcome today Bill Nowak, who is a member of the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel of the Climate Action Council. Bill is also Executive Director of the New York Geothermal Energy Organization and will give us a review of the slides on the draft recommendation presented at the public engagement session held by the panel on February 4th. Buck Moorhead on the call as well, who is a New York Task Force director, and he will kind of moderate at least the questions during the presentation. Afterwards, we can have a more loose discussion regarding the presentation. So it's all yours, Paul.
Thank you, Andreas. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with folks today. I'm going to pull up some slides. As Andreas mentioned, we did have on February 4th a public engagement session. So many of these slides will be from that public engagement session, but there has been activity in the meantime. So I've got some information that has been presented and is public information that will update that. So I am a member, as Andreas said, of the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel to the Climate Action Council. For those of you who are not familiar with the Climate Action Council, it was set up from the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed last year, and which has set ambitious goals for the state of New York relative to greenhouse gas emissions. The Climate Action Council is made up of around 20 folks, many of whom are New York State department heads, but there also are appointees from the governor and the majority and minority leaders of both the Senate and the Assembly. And so there are folks from the New York independent power producers, from National Fuel Gas, from environmental advocates, Bob Howarth, who some of you may know as someone who has great expertise on greenhouse gases. The Alliance for Clean Energy New York is also represented on the panel. So it's an interesting mix of department heads and advocates for various points of view. And the council has set up about 7 different panels, including power generation and agriculture and forestry. I sit on the energy efficiency and housing panel, and this is the makeup of that panel. You can see the chair is, and can people see my pointer here?
Yes.
Showing up, okay. The chair is Ruth Ann Wisnauskas from the Homes and Community Renewal. Janet Joseph, who many of you may know as kind of the power and brains behind the throne at NYSERDA. Janet has been at NYSERDA through several CEOs and is kind of second in command there. And then Peggy Neville from the Department of Public Service. And then these are the appointees to the panel, including myself, some folks representing organized labor, Push Buffalo, larger building companies, community programs in upstate areas, the Community Preservation Corporation, which recently held some interesting webinars, and I understand does very good work in the New York City area, and just a number of different individuals. As we started our work, which was back in October or November, at this point, we broke down into 3 subcommittees, single family housing, multifamily housing, and commercial and institutional, and kind of met in smaller groups for a while and have since kind of all come together in a larger subgroup that's meeting between the public meetings. The Climate Action Council is a state-appointed body, and as such, it has obligations to meet publicly and to give public access If you go to the website, you will see many of the materials from both the council's meetings and then the panel's meetings as well. And I think all these slides are available from various presentations on that website. So as I mentioned, there are three folks from state agencies who are part of the panel, but there is also a pretty intensive staff efforts behind the scenes. They're the folks that have been providing a lot of the data and information and kind of tracking the activities of the panel. So all these different state agencies are involved with the Energy Efficiency and Housing Advisory Panel. So as I mentioned, this was set up under the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which mandates 85% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2050 and a 40% reduction by 2030, which is something, you know, we're getting very close to that date already. So it's pretty intense, the work we need to do. As part of the CLCPA, also, there is a goal of 100% zero carbon electricity generation in New York State by 2040. And this footnote showed up in one of the slides. There is some projection that the housing sector may be counted on to come up with a little more of the greenhouse gas reductions than some of the other sectors that face really hard emissions reduction processes. And we're thinking in terms of transportation with the heavier duty transportation and maybe needing some backup in the electricity generation sector, those kind of things. So we're taking pretty seriously this 40% by 2030 goal and certainly the 85% by 2050. This is a slide that has been produced. Typically, folks think of across the country, think of electricity as being the main source of greenhouse gas emissions. In New York State, that's not the case. In fact, we put out in our newsletter this last week data from the EPA showing that upstate New York has the cleanest electricity generation in the country. Certainly that's not the case on Long Island, and it's less so the case in the New York City area, but electricity in general is a much less significant part of greenhouse gas emissions in New York than it is in many states. And this shows the entire picture, including non-combustion emissions. Usually when you see emissions graphs like this, it will be just what comes from burning fossil fuels. But you can see that heating buildings is a very large part of the emissions picture in New York State. It's over a quarter. And the panel is really looking to building electrification and energy efficiency as the ways to get to this goal of a 40% reduction by 2030 and an 85% reduction by 2050. And just to, you know, combining the goal for electricity to be clean by 2030 and 2040, the idea is that if we electrify the heating technology and it goes with clean electricity, that gets to the goal of cleaning the emissions from the housing sector. And certainly as part of doing that, we want to have energy efficiency. And I'm sure as folks in a passive house group would certainly agree that it's very important to have the buildings to be very efficient, and that both brings down the amount of energy that needs to be supplied and also the costs to people as they move forward in this. So in looking at what our recommendations, we've kind of broken them down into three categories. One is energy efficiency and conservation. That includes building shell and weatherization measures, and also behavioral operations and maintenance. And then in the middle, we see building electrification. Low carbon fuels has been much less of a focus for us. And then decarbonizing the electricity supply. So putting those three together are the way we're going to get to reduce these greenhouse gas emissions. Here's a slide showing some of the timeline. And basically, we're into 2021. During probably April and May, the Climate Action Council is going to be receiving the recommendations, the final recommendations from the panels. They've already heard some of the draft recommendations. And then by the end of the year, they are going to issue a draft scoping plan and then start holding public hearings on the draft scoping plan and deliver a final plan to the governor and the legislature at the end of 2022. You see here in a couple places the greenhouse gas emissions reports from the Department of Environmental Conservation. One of the things that has not happened yet, the CLCPA requires greenhouse gas emissions to be taken on a 20-year time frame as opposed to the 100-year time frame, and to include upstream emissions. So in the whole fracking process for natural gas, for example, all the methane that leaks, and as probably some of the folks in this group know, methane on a 20-year basis has 85 and up times the amount of impact on climate as carbon dioxide. And those haven't yet been taken into account. The DEC has put forth a paper where they're recommending basically a price of $125 a ton on carbon dioxide at this point, which is up from in the 40s from the benefit cost analyses that we've seen in the past. And certainly when you add methane emissions, our calculation is that that takes it up to about $160 a ton. And when I say our, and let me make clear here, as I should have at the beginning, I'm speaking as an individual. I've been participating in this process. I'm using slides that have been vetted and shown publicly on behalf of the committee, but I don't claim to speak for everyone in the committee or to speak officially for the committee. And when I say our calculations on the $160 a ton for the greenhouse gas emissions, that's New York GEO's calculations working from the DEC's figures. And I'd be happy to share those with anybody that's interested in seeing them. I'm interested in getting feedback on the work we've done looking at the value of carbon. So we've had a lot of stakeholder engagement. We had 70 stakeholders provide original written comments. We've had 3 dedicated roundtables. We've had a public input session, as Andreas mentioned, on February 4th, and are inviting ongoing comments. And I don't know if somebody wants to take this down and put it in the chat so everybody's got access to it, but comments can be submitted if there's anything that you're interested in seeing this panel take into consideration or recommend. This is the staff kind of email for taking comments. So it stands for Energy Efficiency and Housing Panel at NYSERDA.NewYork.gov. These are what was presented at the February 4th meeting, and it's about 5 different groups of recommendations. And the first one is basically phasing out fossil fuel use in buildings. This is seen as the key to getting us to where we need to go relative to emissions. And working for a very efficient state energy code as soon as possible. And then a ban in the construction code on gas and oil equipment for space and water heating in single family homes, starting in somewhere near 5 years. We've gone back and forth on the date that we want to propose, and this was meant to be purposefully general. And then for multifamily and commercial buildings, potentially starting at around 10 years. And then, so that is the new construction piece, but looking at all the buildings that already exist. And this is where, the action's really going to need to happen, because there are about 10 or 11,000 new builds in New York State each year, but we have, millions and millions of houses. 7 million, I believe the figure is, across the state, housing units. So there would be a ban on replacement appliances in single family in about 10 years, and in multifamily and commercial buildings starting in 15 years is what's been put out so far. I'm not going to say what I push or what I think in relation to that, but those are things we're looking at. And then replacements for cooking stoves and dryers, potentially starting in 10 years. And then certainly other appliance efficiency standard also in terms of computers, monitors, et cetera. And clearly there's a qualifier in terms of these timeframes needing to adapt to various circumstances and various state processes. We also, in the second category, is energy benchmarking. So for buildings larger than 10,000 square feet, and then data disclosure at the point of sale and point of lease, requiring lighting upgrades and energy efficiency performance standards for buildings larger than 25,000 square feet. Certainly workforce development is going to be an important part of meeting these goals. And there's a strong emphasis on the committee in terms of women and minority business ownership and really getting the training out to where it needs to be in the community. One of the certainly important pieces of the whole process is how is it going to be paid for? And that certainly is not something that we've entirely figured out yet. There is the gentleman who was most actively involved, to my mind, in setting up PACE financing in New York State has put together a working group that's looking to a clean water model. So at this point, communities across New York State are able to access very low cost financing to do clean water upgrades in the community. And they're looking to see if this same model could be applied to provide low cost capital to municipalities to fund the transitions in terms of energy efficiency and electrification. And then they're looking for expanded use of performance contracting for state buildings and school buildings and so forth.
Bill?
Yes.
Could I jump with the question here?
Absolutely.
We had a question from Meg. Meg, do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to paraphrase it for you?
Sure, I can ask it.
Great.
Yeah, I was just wondering, especially for these recommendations for new construction and then single family homes that exist, to put forth those kinds of recommendations. Those are pretty severe, asking people to basically ditch their gas stoves and things like that, which I'm not opposed to. I'm in the market, so I see the desire for those things. So I'm just wondering, these are recommendations, but what sort of timeline are you seeing for actual enactment of these recommendations?
Well, as I mentioned, and let me say I'm getting an induction oven delivered this afternoon, so I'm excited about that process myself. But what we were looking at is for new construction, for 1 to 4 family homes was a time frame of approximately 5 years from now. And then for multifamily buildings, more like 10 years. And I understand what you're saying about this. This will be a shock, I think, to many people across the state, but it is also, you know, as someone whose industry is involved with offering solutions like electrification, basically there is a fairly relaxed attitude at this point in terms of how long we're going to be able to continue burning fossil fuels. You know, your typical building owner will say, yeah, I'm sure that's coming, but you know, it's probably 20 years away and we don't need to worry about that. Let's just set up and go with what we're already familiar with and, you know, what doesn't take much thought. But once people see, and these are grounded in those 40% reduction by 2030 and 85% reduction by 2050, we're not going to get there without these types of mandates. And once the market sees that these mandates are coming in a few years, there will be a very strong adjustment. You know, we look at the number of HVAC installers there are across the state. There are plenty, but most of them are not paying attention to this type of transition. With some mandates in place, they will.
100% agree with everything that you're saying. I guess I'm just curious as to you're making a recommendation, but I'm just wondering, when will we know if it passes and it's going into effect for sure?
Right. As I showed in that slide, the final, I forget what it's called, but basically the scoping plan will be presented to the governor and the legislature at the end of 2022. And I'm hoping that scoping plan will include very specific recommendations in terms of, legislative language, et cetera, that will set all this up and get it moving. But this is a process in the real world. We could have an entirely different state government in another couple years. We could have an entirely different set of circumstances. Climate change could bring the boom down on us again in New York State, the way it did in Sandy, and the consciousness could change and the immediacy could change as well. So it's a process that's still open, but the basic idea is that in 2023 there would be some recommendations ready to be acted on.
Thank you.
That help? Thanks. So we're also obviously going to need incentives to make this happen in terms of direct cash incentives with a priority on LMI households. There's different ideas for ways to make this available. And certainly for much of the housing stock in New York State, there will need to be electric service upgrades and, improvements to people's roofs and various infrastructure that hasn't been taken care of over time that needs to be taken care of to be part of low emissions. There is also some more general considerations in terms of getting from gas to clean energy. At this point, the utilities are advertising gas as clean and climate friendly. And we've been involved with several rate cases, and through those rate cases, we've been getting individual utilities to pledge to stop doing this, but this would be a more general recommendation across the state. At this point, there's a 100-foot rule that is a subsidy where the utility, through its ratepayers, covers most of the cost of new gas connections. And this is basically something that geothermal systems don't get. Air source heat pumps don't get. It's something that gas gets, and that kind of subsidy really needs to stop. At this point, we're still depreciating gas assets on a 65 to 85-year basis, even though most of those assets will no longer able to be used after 2050 if we hit these goals. So that needs to be adjusted. We need to look at the policy changes that need to happen as part of this transition and take care of the workforce so that there's a just transition, et cetera. We're also looking at things happening on the federal level, at things like utility rate design, consumer protection. Certainly, that's something that some of the LMI advocates are paying particular attention to, and really doing this in a way that benefits the economy to the greatest degree we can. So we had our first public input session on February 4th. The comments that were provided back, we had 300 people at that session. The comments included broad support for building electrification and energy efficiency. Folks wanted more specificity on the timelines with the date certain, and a number of them were looking for sooner dates than the ones that were presented in that context. Folks were looking for education and outreach being really important, as this is going to be a major change across the state. Keeping it affordable and looking at the resilience of all electric buildings as well. There were concerns relative from housing advocates and developers to get additional input. Folks saying that biodiesel and biofuels should also be explored. Folks raising issues relative to refrigerants that are part of heat pumps and the greenhouse gas emissions that go with those. And there was also some support for the Community Climate and Community Investment Act, which is something that New York Renews, the organization that was the prime advocate for the CLCPA. This is their bill this term that proposes a fee on climate pollution as it enters New York State. So not like the New York ISO at this point has a proposal to put a fee on carbon in the electricity generation sector. This would be economy-wide, the CCIA would be. We also had some roundtables where, you know, many of the kind of concerns that people have about moving forward were brought up. I'm sorry, I'm going to move through the next couple slides pretty quickly, and it won't give you much time to look at them, but I did want to kind of finish up by a little after 12:30, so there would be plenty of time for discussion. So there was also a meeting with condo owners in New York City, and they were pretty alarmed about the idea of having to comply with these kind of mandates. And their comments were taken, and folks are trying to figure out how to integrate them exactly at this point. And then we had a cross-panel discussion with the power generation panel. And a lot of what we're looking at is what the grid impact is going to be of electrifying, not just the building sector, but also the transportation sector, and how much that's going to add to the peak electricity need. In New York State at this point, we have a very unbalanced peak demand. About for a few hours a year, the demand is twice what it is on average for the rest of the year. And this is a lot of capacity that needs to be funded. And so there is concern that as we electrify the heating system and the transportation system, that really needs to be coordinated. In relation to that, there is a cost premium at this point, but for new construction, it's nearing parity. But there's no one size fits all for retrofits. Including basic shell upgrades with electrification is cost effective, and that reduces the grid impact. They noted that ground source heat pumps paired with a basic shell upgrade can offer greater grid benefits than air source heat pumps paired with deeper shell measures in many cases.
Bill, can I jump in with a couple more questions here?
Sure.
Mark, Willie, do you want to state your question there, Mark? Is this something that could be open source and used by other municipalities, cities, counties, and states? This information that you're presenting?
If he's asking if I can make these slides available, yes, these are publicly available slides. I'm not quite sure what the open source is. And if folks would like presentations for their municipality, I could certainly ask the panel staff to provide some of those also. Does that answer your question?
Mark will chip in if it doesn't. It sounds helpful.
Okay.
One other quick, Cameron.
Well, regarding the main source of the power supply for the grid, will they now be all renewable?
That is the mandated goals as, let me think about what the phrasing is. 70% of the power generated in New York would be renewable by 2030, and it would all be carbon neutral by 2040. Does that help?
A little bit. And the other side of this coin is that most buildings now rely on AC power. With the advent of photovoltaics and small wind and so forth, and all the transfer losses that occur switching from DC and AC in buildings, there are a number of people that believe that buildings are going to go DC power in the next 10 to 15 years. Is that being taken into account with the power companies?
Good question. And it's something I've heard. I'm not an engineer myself. And I would suggest that question goes to the power generation panel. I don't know looking into the future, how much is going to be AC and how much is going to be DC, and how they're taking that into consideration.
Meg, you had a question. Do you want to say that one, Meg?
Yes, hi, sorry, I have one more question, and that is regarding the power outages that we've experienced, severe power outages, especially in Lower Westchester, to the point where the gas generator.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Oh, especially so much that generators are on back order. I mean, we can't even order generators or anything for clients that are, wanting them so badly. But I realized, we could go to solar, but the fact is that Con Ed cuts all ties for people in residential. They cut all the solar off when the power goes out, so that the power doesn't hurt somebody who's maintaining the lines. So we're in this quandary where we could be stuck without anything for at least down here we go 7 days, I just wondered if you had considered, backup supply.
Right. That's a large part of what the power generation panel is looking at. We have had one cross panel discussion with them, so I'm not totally familiar with what they're looking at, but certainly the resilience of the system is important. One of the things that people think is that somehow they have better resilience by having a gas furnace coupled with the electric supply to their house, such that if the electric power went down, they'd still be able to use the gas furnace. But in almost all cases at this point, gas furnaces rely on electronic ignition. They rely on connection to an electric thermostat, and certainly to circulate the heat throughout the house, they use either an electric fan for the air or an electric pump for the water. So there's not that kind of positive redundancy that you would get by holding on to fossil fuels for the internal heating system. That being said, the resilience of the grid and the necessity of the grid being able to withstand events, and I'm going to point to one here. This is the challenging period that's looked at. Basically, if we go electric with our vehicles and our buildings in the late 30s, the late 2030s, there will be a transition from a summer peak to a winter peak. And the day that puts the most stress on the grid will be a winter day. And so, a very cold week in the winter with not much wind blowing, if those circumstances come together, it will be a real challenge. And, they're looking at different types of backup at this point. As I said, I'm not on that panel, but that's certainly something that they're needing to take into account. And so as we look at the gas transition, there are millions and probably billions of dollars worth of gas infrastructure in New York State at this point, between all the mains and distribution lines and service lines. These are going to be used less and less as people move off of gas. And at some point, there will be a tipping point when it just becomes too expensive to use gas. And we have to make sure that it's not going to be the poorest among us who are going to be left holding the bag at that point. So it's going to take some really careful planning. So, one of the things that we need to look at is the principles for a just transition and for equity. And I'm not going to go through each of these, but, people need to be engaged in the planning and in the process of it. There has to be preservation of local cultures and traditions as part of it. The health of people needs to be important. Access to jobs needs to be an important part of this transition when we're talking about equity. The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act mandates that 35 to 40% of the spending and benefits needs to happen in disadvantaged and minority communities. So taking these kind of things into account as we're doing this planning is important. So looking at the emissions, and basically this is emissions past what would happen otherwise. There are already things in play making us more efficient that will save greenhouse gas emissions. But basically for buildings in New York State, it's either 61 or 63 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent that is produced in New York State that we're looking to get reduced. And of that, you know, about 1/3 is commercial and 2/3 is residential. And you can see here, it's mainly space heating. This is commercial space heating, large multifamily space heating, residential small multifamily, and residential single family. And then you have water heating, cooking, and other is kind of the way it breaks down in the building sector. Most of it at this point is natural gas. About 2/3 of it is natural gas. And then there's also petroleum, propane, and fuel oil. And what we're looking basically is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2050. This is kind of the curve that does it. We stop electric resistance heating because that is very inefficient. We move to heat pumps, which is the green section. There is a distinction being made, and I don't understand this yet, between efficient natural gas and reference natural gas, which somehow increases for a little while before winding down. And then this is the fuel oil that winds down between now and 2050. And they're figuring the amount that comes from reference shell, which is basically what we have today, and then a more efficient shell definitely adds to the greenhouse gas emission reductions. So relative to building decarbonization, it meets the emissions reduction targets, and it involves zero emissions appliance standards and shell upgrades as well. As far as costs, there is a cost premium. They can be mitigated through cost compression, integrative design, and other factors. We need to manage the grid impacts as part of this by pairing electrification with at least basic shell upgrades to reduce the grid peak. And they know that ground source heat pumps can offer additional grid benefits because ground source heat pumps on the coldest day of the year are still going to be using the relatively warm ground as the source of the heat. That doesn't change as the weather gets more extreme, as opposed to the way it is with air source heat pumps. Here we go and look at some of the contributions of the different policy pieces, and they're estimating the building code changes could change about 5 million metric tons, and then the retrofits and the disclosure items could reduce a great deal of the emissions. Excuse me. But overall, electrifying the heating coupled with clean electricity gets to the full 44 million. So some of these will start us off on the path, and then they kind of get subsumed once a building's heat source is clean in and of itself. This is some preliminary findings relative to the peak situation in New York State. At this point, we have a summer peak of around 33 gigawatts. Normally, on a normal day, New York State is using somewhere around 17 or 18 gigawatts worth of power. On the hottest day of the summer, it goes up to about 33 gigawatts. And that's what some of those some of the items that were referenced in Westchester where the power goes out. I assume that was probably in the summer area. At this point, the winter peak is well below that at about 26 gigawatts. If we went with ground source heat pumps and basic shell for this transition, we would increase the peak that we need to build out the electricity system for by about 4 gigawatts. If we did it with air source and deep shell improvements, it would be significantly more. Air source and basic shell improvements, it would be still significantly more than that. And then air source with no shell improvements this would be a massive undertaking for our electricity system to take in terms of building new renewable capacity. One of the things they're looking at is the improvement in the way the heat pumps function over time. The geothermal one should be a little stronger than that, but this shows that there is some potential for reducing that impact on the grid. In terms of the peak, shell upgrades are important and cost effective. Ground source heat pumps are a good way to do this without impacting the grid to as great a degree as we would otherwise. And the cost premiums can be mitigated through cost compression as the market scales. And that's it for the slides I was going to go through. So I want to thank everybody for listening, and happy to have questions and discussion.
Thanks, Bill, for the great presentation. Yeah, but you can take more of those questions. Yes. Everyone can also start to unmute yourself if you like to ask.
Yeah, I'll throw out one quick logistical question. Is it possible that these slides had a lot of information on there, Bill? Is this something that would be available that maybe we could post on New York Passive House's website or could make available to people? Is that possible? Your overall presentation here?
Yeah, because this is taken from slides that are publicly available, why don't I email Andreas? This is about a few different presentations. Why don't I email those to Andreas? On behalf of the panel, I'd be more comfortable giving you what has been officially put out there rather than what I've condensed.
Whatever you're good with would be very helpful to give people a chance to look at it independently. Would be
great. Happy to do that. Yep.
And I'll put out just the last question from the chat. Ask Edwin May if you want to ask your question about historical perspective, Edwin.
Oh, sure. Hey, Buck. Hi, Bill. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Hey. Well, thank you so much for the talk. This was terrific. It's really interesting. I'm really curious to know your thoughts, though, and I wonder if you could speak to a little bit. I wonder what other similar historical shifts you're using as a sort of mental model as you do your work and the panel does its important work here. What other shifts are you looking to as both precedent and sort of maybe warning? Your comment about making sure that certain populations don't bear the brunt of these kinds of transitions is apt and I think really interesting. So I'm wondering what you're looking at both as historical precedent and as sort of mental model for your work moving forward, and sort of how we should think about this in context and sort of what we can use as a sort of map for these types of transitions moving forward.
Well, that's a great question. And in some ways, I feel like we're, because of the crisis that we're in relative to the climate, we're in a fairly unprecedented area of having an industry that is this significantly built up with the backing of the state through the Public Service Commission and state law, and having to decapitalize that over a relatively short period of time. There are slides that we've included in some of the presentations that New York GEO has given, showing the transitions that have already happened between, heating in the United States was done with wood for probably a century or two, and then it moved into coal. When I grew up, there was a coal chute in the house that I first lived in. And from there we moved to oil, and from there we moved to gas. And those transitions were less than, a couple centuries each of those. The one we're facing today is going to be more rapid, and it will need to be more kind of strictly enforced in terms of doing mandates. The other, the coal to oil to gas was more happening because of market dynamics and had a longer time to play out. And particularly in terms of heating, and something that people require on a daily basis in the winter, and the kind of changes we've seen relative to income and wealth over the last period, with more and more of the wealth going to the top and people at the bottom being left with less. Kind of making sure this happens in a way that is equitable is extremely complicated and really important to do right. did that answer what you were looking for? I wish I had better examples that, provide us with a really clear path forward.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. It's really helpful. Can I ask one follow-up question? I don't mean to monopolize.
Absolutely, yeah, go ahead.
So to bring that to the building sector in particular, I'm really curious, again, to know your thoughts. I'm really curious in this distinction between the, let's call it the electrification and the improvements to the building shell. And so to bring the question of sort of historical models to the buildings, do you see any model or past thread that would lead you to believe that it's possible to improve building shells at the scale that's needed here? It seems to me that the change in technology, there seems to be a lot of precedent for that. That seems to be like a thing that we've seen in the past. But the question of could you build a lot of more high quality buildings? I'm curious to know if you see any sort of precedents for that type of transition.
Not so much. My background is in the geothermal and doing the technology transition. Certainly, we have had work done on our house. We have gotten new windows a few years ago, and it made things a lot more comfortable here. But I think this group would probably be much better at providing some examples and some estimate of the possibility than I certainly could. I'm sure there's some brains on this call that have that question down.
I'll step in. My only thought to that, just off the top of my head is, remember, once upon a time we all had single pane windows, and that was a significant shift in technology when at the time of window replacements we transitioned to double pane or thermal pane windows. So window technology is one of those things that I think it's now commonplace, and it's even been codified. And frankly, most construction codes wouldn't even allow us to use single pane or non-thermally broken windows in new construction, and depending on permitting requirements, even replacements. So but it's a bit bespoke. That's also what climate zone are we in? What are we designing for? When we get to deep shell retrofits, that's a bit more aggressive. That is more aggressive. I don't think it's insurmountable. I also look at how fast the evolution of the mindset of going for higher performance buildings and to passive house and beyond is picking up in the marketplace. A lot of this is going to be business driven, and some of it's going to be code driven. I have to think about that some more, Ed. You and I've been having this conversation in a serial form anyway. I think we'll continue that.
The policies that are adopted are going to be important. We're looking in the heat pump transition at this point. The rebate programs basically are for larger buildings are based on projected MMBTU savings. And it kind of forces folks to choose between shell improvements and installing heat pumps, and we're looking to try and get them to change that so that if they do both, they will have adequate incentives provided to do both, as opposed to making them work against each other.
I think Bill makes a good point, and some area where we need policy improvement is, and sometimes it'll come individually and then programmatic level, and then potentially out to policy at the local and state level, is looking at buildings from with a master planning of capital improvements perspective, so that we can get away from replacement in kind, which doesn't move the needle at all, and replacement at time of end of useful life. If the building doesn't have an overall capital improvement master plan, you're going to be doing things out of sequence, replacing a boiler when you really ought to be replacing the windows first, air sealing and thermal envelope performance in advance of any mechanical system improvement or replacement. So these things have to be looked at with a strategic sequencing involved. And there's no, there are some people that think that way with their buildings, but until that becomes commonplace, we're going to get cart before the horse a lot, and less than optimal outcomes from that.
Yeah, local law 97 is encouraging that kind of step-by-step retrofit master planning, which you're referencing there, Tom.
Yeah, it is, but I think then it's still back to, we have a huge task in educating all of those that have to do that planning and make those decisions, because from my perspective, there's still a scant few that really kind of understand that. And at the same time, I think one of the beauties of local law 97 is it's agnostic as to technology and technique. It is, in fact, it's strictly outcome. It's an outcome metric. It's a performance metric, and it allows for the flexibility of getting there in any number of ways. So it's not prescriptive in any way other than saying, here's your budget, here's your GHG emissions limit.
Yeah.
Do what you need to do to meet it. So that allows a lot of creativity and flexibility. At the same time, master planning for capital improvements is going to be crucial.
Yeah.
So I see the question from Nick about a quick reference for basic versus deep shell upgrades. Those slides and that data was put together by a consortium of companies, including the Rocky Mountain Institute and E3. And I haven't seen a definition of basic versus deep, so can't help them with that.
Can you scroll up in that chat there?
Yes.
You'll be able to pick up there are a couple of other unaddressed questions there, not yet addressed.
Okay, I see relative to commercial and residential, the residential, the single family that we're using or the small residential is 1 to 4 families, 1 to 4 units. If that helps.
I add a caution to that? In that if you're talking in New York State, if you're talking about energy code compliance, remember that the energy code defines a residential building as 1 or 2 family and 3 stories or less. Anything else is a commercial building in the eyes of the energy code.
Yeah, I can remember a discussion about that, and people brought up, some places define it this way and others the other way, but that's what had been used in our group.
Yeah.
I see a question from Meg relative to cost. The data that has been produced for us shows essentially pretty close to parity at this point for electrified house home building. When she says the cost is too high, one of the things that doesn't get taken into account there is the 100-foot rule, which provides the gas infrastructure for free to folks. And we're looking to change that. Whether we'll be successful or not, I don't know, but that definitely changes the picture. If folks had to pay for the gas lines coming into the house, it would bring much more parity there.
Could I just ask, since we have this group together, could I just ask a quick question? I'm working on, do people know what Article 7, R22 of the New York State budget is? Do you all know about that?
No.
But everyone here is very interested in local law 97 and that it'll hold up and that it kind of enforces the changes in buildings in the city of New York. And so what happens with R22 is it allows the real estate interests to pay away their obligation. So my thinking about that is that if you have buildings that are terrifically inefficient and they aren't being changed, then they're going to stay inefficient and there won't be incentives or investments in making those changes. Instead, people will pay that off. In any case, in the state budget, that position is going to go in place before the end of March. So I'm reading lots of different organizations that are reacting to that. And so the question is, what do you all think about that as a threat, or is it something that you're comfortable with? Because the investments can go to improving the grid, and they can go to, for example, building the connections between Canadian hydropower and New York City, for example.
Bob, I don't know if you're asking me or the group.
I'm asking the group, but I'm asking
Okay.
you as a leader, because it seemed like you were assuming that local law 97 would be in place and would be enforced like that. And a lot of that was an assumption in a lot of what you presented. But with these payments, then it won't be.
Yeah, so basically developers in New York City, instead of improving their buildings, could invest in a wind project upstate or a transmission project, which would have a benefit to the state, but would not take care of those buildings. So yeah, I do see that as a problem. The folks I've seen kind of analyzing and talking about it see it as a problem as well. You know, why it's in there, we can speculate, but it does seem to be something that loosens things up in a way that is not going to be helpful relative to getting the building sector taken care of.
Well, even if you electrify them, still they're going to be terrifically inefficient, and you will not have made the fundamental improvements that are needed.
Yes, do we have any other questions?
Okay, I am.
Yeah.
Sorry. So, yeah, my question has to do with, is there a transition that we can go to achieve this zero carbon? There has been many chip plants being installed in New York, combined heating and power. And in fact, where I live in Stuyvesant Town has two under construction. They would supply all of the heat, hot water, and as well as some electricity. And by the way, they have installed something like 9,700 solar panels on the roof of Stuyvesant Town that currently double the installed capacity of all solar in all of New York City. So they're doing a lot, and the combined heating and power plant construction is getting a lot of resistance. And it would be a gas operation. I'm wondering maybe if there's some biofuel gas they could use. So do you have any information about that? And then just quickly, Bill, that was a terrific presentation. And I don't know if you know Dr. Richard Perez at the University of Albany, and he's conducted a lot of research about using solar, wind, and battery storage capacity to meet our energy needs. And he has a very compelling argument for it. And I don't know if you've ever contacted him, but so those are my two questions. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm familiar with that name. I haven't met him, and I'm told he does really good work. So
you should meet him. you two would be good. Seems like a good partnership.
Great, great. Relative to combined heat and power, I think in general it's a bit of a half measure compared to where we need to go. But we do have a lot of different building typologies that we're going to need to take care of, and some of which are easier and some of which are harder to electrify. So that's probably going to remain an option for some buildings.
Right. Well, I mean, we've tried to, in a pilot program, tried to encourage management to install a battery backup system, solar powered battery backup that would just operate the elevators in our 90 building complex during an emergency. And we've had a number of them, including Sandy. And there was a lot of resistance within the city of New York. I mean, we know that from solar and houses and storage. So is there anything that battery backup that would help in this regard? That I know it's not your area of expertise, but do you know anything in that regard on a large scale?
I don't, and I'm not familiar with the resistance, not sure where it comes from or what the substance of it is.
The
but
fire
it seems-
department.
Okay.
New York City Fire Department. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. So,
And they were concerned that the solar would continue working even though the power was out, and thus they would maybe expose their workers to a problem.
yes, that's one part. Islanding was one part, but the other is having a battery backup. The requirements for a storage capacity that would meet the fire 2-hour or 3-hour fire rating is and its location. They were really resistant to finding and approving a location.
Hmm.
Now maybe things are changing. I don't know, but
Yeah, well, that's beyond my technical
Yeah.
capacity. The
Maybe
Alliance
other
for
people.
Clean Energy might be a good organization to go to with that question.
okay, sure.
It's a woman by the name of Ann Reynolds, who's the head of that group, Alliance for Clean Energy.
Alliance, thank you.
Okay, guys, I would say we are getting to the end. I would like to thank everyone on the call for participating. I would like to thank Bill for your fantastic presentation and Buck for moderating. I think it's fairly clear that the panel sees efficiency of buildings as a very important part, right, of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I would hope that since passive house is kind of a standard which is not just looking at the building shell or the mechanical systems, but looks at the building at the holistic approach, that such a system or such a concept would be involved. I don't know if that is possible, but specifically for, of course, new construction, we know that most people who do passive houses, we can achieve all electric buildings quite cost effectively, and they're competitive. So it would be good for us as a group to be more involved. I think it would be great, since I think we can offer quite a lot of those solutions you're looking for, and not necessarily only looking at building upgrade or mechanical systems upgrade, but really look at the entire building as system, and make good decisions on those. So with that said, I thank you, everyone. I will make that presentation or some sort of the presentation available and with the video or with the recording, and we'll also forward Bill's email, I think, so that people can follow up if they like to.
Sure.
Perfect. Thanks
Thanks,
so much,
everybody.
Thank you all.